Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I'll be converting this Warlord Games resin Flower Class Corvette model to HMCS Sackville. HMCS Sackville served with the Royal Canadian Navy from 1941 to 1946 through the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, and survives to this day alongside Halifax, Nova Scotia as Canada's naval memorial. As usual, the table of contents with some bookmarks to various things throughout the video, if you want to skip ahead, will be listed in the description, along with the crafting related materials that I used. The first material is not listed there because it's a sort of common everyday item, but it is a Kleenex box. I'm going to be cutting out the base for the model out of this cardboard. Now, I don't necessarily recommend you do this, as the cardboard does warp later on when working on the base and applying acrylic paint and glue, which isn't ideal for the look of the diorama necessarily. I am making this up more as a diorama than as a playing piece because I don't really play Warlord Games Cruel Seas, the game this model was made for. But I thought, given the occasion, that is today, the day the video was posted, is Battle of the Atlantic Day in Canada, I just wanted to make up a model that was somewhat thematic and would serve as a bit of a commemoration for that day. Battle of the Atlantic Day, for those who don't know, is the day on which we commemorate the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who worked together through the Battle of the Atlantic at the height of World War II, contributing greatly to the success of the Allies over Nazi Germany. HMCS Sackville, for her part, was a convoy escort and participated in escorting 30 convoys across the Atlantic, fighting off several submarines and, evidently, surviving as a ship to this day. I'll talk a little bit more about Canada's Naval Memorial at the end of the video, but let's get to the crafting now. For this process, I'm just drawing out a rectangle on the piece of Kleenex box that's a couple centimeters larger than the ship in all dimensions. This is just going to give me a little bit of space to paint on some waves and add some detail later that will contribute to the sort of atmosphere of the diorama, which is intended to be HMCS Sackville at some point in her transit across the Atlantic escorting a convoy at the height of the war. I'll also preface now, her paint scheme is modeled after HMCS Sackville as she is painted alongside now. I understand that that isn't necessarily authentic to how she was in World War II, but when I have a reference photo album that includes some of my own photos and something I've seen in person, I mean, why wouldn't I use it? The model itself is a highly detailed resin model, as you can see, and she is a real pleasure to work with. The thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to mark down on the base where the ship will sit after all is said and done, because I'm going to use that as a sort of model around which to paint on the wake later on when we're working on the base. For now though, I'm going to want to make sure that the ship and the metal accoutrements she comes with are thoroughly trimmed, cleaned, and prepared for painting. Resin and metal miniatures frequently come out of molds with potentially some mold release agents on them, which helps release them from the actual mold they were cast in, not release them from mold the fungus, and may prevent paint from sticking. They also will come with little pieces of flash, we call it, which is these bits of additional resin that has flowed into cracks in the model or otherwise settled where it shouldn't have from the casting process. With a pair of flush cutters and an X-Acto knife and maybe some files, you should be able to trim all of this fairly easily. I'm showing here a few locations that I found the most egregious pieces of flash, just so that if you get the same model, maybe you can look there and catch those same things. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off these sort of panels that are on either side of the forecastle. HMCS Sackville, as she is on display right now, doesn't have them, so I saw no reason to keep them on the miniature. Trimming them is a bit of a difficult process. The resin cracks almost more than cutting, so you'll want to do it carefully in order to make sure you don't leave too much of a jagged edge on the sides. If you do, there's ways to clean it up, and you'll see that my cuts aren't exactly clean either, so we're going to go over that now. With file, you can rub them away. You can also use the sharp or blunt edge of a knife to just sort of rub at them. If you scrape with a knife, like a hobby knife, an X-Acto knife, you should be able to just remove thin layers at a time and slowly smooth things down. You will want to make sure that you don't let the knife skid off and either hurt yourself or drive a big gouge into, for example, the shielding just forward of the gun mount on Sackville here. The metal pieces of the miniature also require a little bit of care. They've got spruing pieces and little pieces of flash from the casting process as well. I didn't worry too much about little pieces of flash, but this piece of sprue you can see is a fairly long component that's going to, well, it makes the gun barrel not look like a gun barrel, so that definitely needs to go. On the bottoms as well, the pegs that are used to insert the guns and other components into the resin hull are often, I found, too long, which is better than too short, I guess. You'll want to cut them down to the right length, and you'll want to sand them as well, because by roughing up their surface, same with roughing up the surface of the resin, if it's possible for you to do. I couldn't get any files into the tiny holes. But if you can rough up the surface of the resin and the metal, it'll give a better surface for your glue to grip to. The reason all of these items are sitting on a paper towel right now is because I have just washed them. That same mold release agent I mentioned earlier does not only impede paint from clinging to the metal and resin, but it'll also impede your glue from getting a good grip. So you'll want to make sure everything's well washed off before you start trying to attach things. When you are attaching them, I recommend you have a set of tweezers. I've got these little angled tweezers I found at a hobby shop, and also a super glue that you like working with. I use a thicker super glue, this Gorilla Glue gel, because it to me tends to stay in place a little bit better and actually glue the right parts together, as opposed to a more liquid super glue that'll flow and get everywhere and make a dreadful mess. So get the materials you want here, but the tweezers in particular are very useful for carefully positioning something and nudging it into line afterwards. The crew in particular benefit from a gel super glue because their attachment points, their little feetsies, are so small it's very difficult to get any other kind of super glue to stick on them. So by using the gel glue, I'm just tapping their feet into the little bulb I've pressed out the end of the glue tube, and that's giving little balls of super glue on the bottom of their feet that I can then use once I place them to affix them in place. Again, here with my big fat fingers I would not have been able to line that up quite as well, but with the tweezers I could sort of nudge them back and forth. With metal miniatures as well, you can also keep the pewter, any of the pewter that you cut off for flash or for spruing. I keep it into little Tupperwares, and I've made experiments in the past with trying to cast my own miniatures, so this just gives me a little bit of cheap pewter to work from. There are obviously lots of issues with using mixed batches of pewter like this, but I'm not a casting tutorial channel just yet, so I'm not going to get into that too much. For priming, I use Vallejo Surface Primer, fired out of a Badger 105 airbrush. The airbrush just gives me such a good control over what I'm applying and such a thin coat that I really can't go back to priming with a brush. That being said, you can apply Vallejo Surface Primer with a brush. Just be careful, I had a big issue with it bubbling when I did so. So you'll want to apply it very carefully and be sure to avoid that. Don't thin it out in order to avoid the bubbling though, because thinning out primer will not make it as effective as primer. Now I'm just mixing together white ink, blue ink, and Airbrush Flow Improver to make a very cool off-white that I'm going to use as the base color for Sackville. After this, we're going to be applying the next layer, which is actually the texture layer for the Razzle Dazzle Camouflage. To do that, I'm going to have to mask off parts of the miniature. I decided to use this sort of cheap dollar store painter's tape. Just tear it down into strips, apply it over the miniature, and try to match the pattern I see in pictures of HMCS Sackville herself. I recommend trying to take the tape and sort of press it against your jeans or some other surface in order to remove a little bit of its stick before you put it onto the miniature, just because the tape itself is going to stick to the primer and the ink you've just applied, and spoiler alert, that can cause you some issues. I've applied this all over the miniature, you can see, and I tried to do so in such a way that I would block off all of the areas I didn't want blue. I was mostly effective. I think there's a couple places where I got a little bit of overspray, or even it flowed under the tape, but overall this did make the process, I think, much quicker and more accurate than it would have been if I had been trying to do this pattern by hand. I have exceptionally shaky hands, so I was not up for that challenge just yet. I use the same sort of mixture of a white ink, a blue ink, and some flow improver, except I use a little more blue to get the pale blue that's used in the contrast color of Sackville's camouflage. And then proceeded to remove the tape. Now you can see here we're going to have the little issue. It's stuck a little too well to the ship itself and peeled away a little bit of the ink and primer there. That's too bad, but here's a little more satisfying shot where it pulls away and leaves a clean line. So on our port side of the waterline we've got this peeled away area. I'm just going to cover it up with more primer after this, and hopefully the primer I've put on with the brush is just going to blend it in, because I do have the Vallejo Gray Surface Primer. If you don't have the Vallejo Gray Surface Primer, put on a little bit of black and then cover it up again with white ink and try to match the color as best you can. It turned out the Gray Surface Primer was really close, and then I could use a mix of white and blue ink to just blend it in again afterwards. I then went around and touched up all of the lines And I used a little bit of the more blue camouflage color to paint in the lifeboats, because again, they're blue right now on display. I don't really know what color they were in World War II, but that's good enough for me. I now grab a little bit of black ink and I start working on the details that are black all over the ship. You want to watch out with this because the ship's paint scheme is obviously very light, so black that's overspilled is probably going to show quite a bit. You can cover it up, but it takes a little bit of work. So just get some black into all of the little details, and especially up forward, you'll want it on the ship's cable and on the actual assemblage of the gun. And then the next base color I'm applying is just some brown to all the wooden areas, such as the deck of the life rafts, this little wooden bit back aft. And I'm going to start touching up the colors of the crew, which is light blue for the helmets, dark blue for the uniforms, and skin color for their faces. For the windows back aft, I actually did something a little more interesting. I jeweled them, which is to say I tried to make the impression of reflective glass. I did this by starting with a darkish blue, then using a light blue diagonally over the lower half of the window, and then an even lighter blue just in the bottom right corner, you can see, to make a sort of reflection effect, and a white dot up in the far left top corner. That gives a pretty nice effect pretty quickly. You can do that for windows on anything from aircraft to, you know, mechs and battle mechs and stuff like that, just to give yourself a little bit of depth to the glass and make it stand out from everything else. For the rest of the miniature here, I'm just going to start applying a black wash. This black wash is a mix of black ink, brown ink, water, and airbrush flow improver to try and get a sort of really thin, flowy consistency that'll sit in crevices. You'll also see that on the sides of the ship, it'll actually make tide marks. Now, I've mentioned in the past that I try to avoid tide marks in my washes. On the ship, I wasn't too worried about it because it's a ship at sea. On the one hand, I don't want it to look gross and grody and rusty everywhere because the crew should have some pride. But on the other hand, I did want to make it look like a ship at sea. For the Naval Ensign, I apply first a layer of white, then very, very carefully put some blue in the top corner of the flag. And then I'll be coming in with red to make the St. George's Cross across the middle. This was pretty nerve-wracking because, again, I've got pretty shaky hands, but by just using the very, very tip of a brush and some ink that I've made sure to tap off before bringing it over so I don't have a big bulb of ink on the end of the paintbrush, I managed to get a pretty good effect that I'm quite proud of. As we go onto the base itself, you can see I've drawn the outline of the ship earlier, and then I drew some lines on where I think this sort of the normal natural waves should sit and the bow wake should be. I'm going to go in and I'm just going to cover the whole thing in sort of a bluish green and then start working my way up in lighter and lighter bluish greens. And then start putting white on top of where I expect the waves to be and blending it in aggressively with my brush. Don't use your most expensive or nicest brush for this because it really did mess up the tips of the bristles on the brush quite a bit, but this is a brush that I use normally for basing normal sort of on foot miniatures, so it is a little messed up from rubbing over baking soda and sand and all the basic materials anyway. So I just lay in the white there, and then again I'm going to just mash it in and try to blend it down into a pale blue-green over top of everything else. There's probably some other ways you could do the seas. I've seen some cool ideas online about making ocean effects from paper mache or with sort of more expensive Vallejo water textures and stuff like that, but I didn't have any of that on hand, so for this case I just went with applying the acrylic paints in layers. The end effect is pretty good, but I will say again, it warped the cardboard significantly. So if you were going to do this, I would recommend either maybe finding a way to glue down, like pin down the cardboard and pre-wet it like you would if you were watercolor painting, or otherwise find a different material to make the base out of. That being said, the warping isn't atrocious, and if you don't look too closely, it kind of looks like the base is just textured and wavy anyway, so it's not too bad for my first attempt at a naval miniature. Laying in the white lines here, I tried to give the effect of a little bit of water and sea on the sides of the ship, the little bit of foam, but this itself you don't want to keep perfectly white because I'm going to paint the foam itself on top of the glue we apply to give a little bit of water texture. That'll make a little more sense as we get forward in steps, but here just make sure you're blending it down and you're not getting a bright white because this is the subsurface sort of bubbles and disturbance that you're seeing. This is what's below the surface of the waves. This was again an entirely new experience for me and it was kind of interesting because I haven't painted naval miniatures before or anything like that, so making it up more or less as I go along, and you can see that sort of from the amount of different paint that's been applied to this base. I will probably say If you applied a little less paint and just went in with a more directed plan for the base, you might also reduce the amount of warping. But that's for you to decide, I guess, at this point. Moving on from there, I'm just going to go back to Sackville while the base is drying and paint on her hull number. By paint, I mean draw, because I'm not going to do that with a paintbrush. Reference the earlier discussion about shaky hands. I have a Pigma Micron, well, I have a set of Pigma Micron pens that I use for drawing. And these are honestly perfect for drawing onto miniatures. I use them frequently for doing eyes and other small black details. And in this case, the hull number, taken from a picture you can see on my phone just there in the right side, draws on quite well. The Pigma Microns, their ink applies super well over top of most of the paints and primers and such that I use. So I strongly recommend, if you can get a hold of some, maybe with a coupon from a local art store or something, recommend you get a hold of some, because not only are they good for drawing, but they're also excellent for small detail on miniatures. I use hot glue to fix the ship in place here, because hot glue should hold it quite well, or at least well enough for my purposes, and is really, really easy to apply. It also gave me a little bit of working time to nudge the ship back and forth while the glue is cooling, and get the ship into the position I wanted it. I now grabbed some gloss Mod Podge. I normally use matte Mod Podge for applying grass and stuff like that, but at this point, the ship itself, I have varnished it. So I've applied a matte varnish just to pull it down and unify the sort of glossiness of all of the paints and textures that we've applied to it. And I'm just going in for the base now, which I do want to be glossy because I want this to look like the actual water. In order to do that, I push the glue into lines, sort of where my wake and my waves were supposed to be, and just nudge it into that position with tapping motions. Therefore, I leave wavy, undulating surface elsewhere. And at the waves themselves, I build up small ridges. I also build up quite a lot of glue up by the bow. It doesn't look quite as rough as I think the bow wake should, but that's probably down to it just being it's glossy Mod Podge. It settles down. It's very fluid. Once it's applied, I grab some white paint and just tap it on to the tops of all of the waves to actually make that sea foam effect. This is why you don't want to put the white on as part of the color for the base itself. You want to put it on now because, well, you're now on the surface of the wave as opposed to beneath it. With that, the miniature is complete, and as you can see, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think it was a really good model, and hopefully you think so as well. I'm just going to loop back around now and talk about Battle of the Atlantic Day. Battle of the Atlantic Day this year is not really being commemorated openly because of the pandemic we have going on. But it's still a day that we should commemorate. It still harkens back to our history and the history of our military and what they managed to achieve in World War II. And on that thought, HMCS Sackville here, she is the Canadian Naval Memorial. I've put a link in the description to the Canadian Naval Memorial website where they talk about HMCS Sackville, her history and such, if you want to learn more about it. They also are taking donations right now because they aren't able to make up any revenue and don't know if this summer they're going to be able to display Sackville. So if you would like to support them, I strongly recommend you go through and maybe make a small donation just to help them keep this ship in the water and keep her on display as the last surviving Flower class corvette in the world. On display and very well maintained, and she's available every summer if you do manage to make your way down to Halifax to go see her. Now, in light of the somberness of the occasion and recent events, I'm going to end this episode a little differently than I normally do. I'd like to invite you to take a moment of silence to remember all members of the Canadian Armed Forces and Armed Forces around the world who have passed away in the name of freedom and defending what they believe in the past and the present and even more recently. We will remember them.